Welcome to Feedstuffs 365 and National Hog Farmer. I'm Ann Hess. How much does nursery pig management and feeding practices come into play when it comes to pig livability? Joining us to answer this question and more from the International Conference on Pig Livability is Jordan Gebhardt, Kansas State University. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Before we jump into our conversation today, I'd like to remind the audience if you have any questions, you can post those there in the chat, or if you're tuning in via social media, you can post those there in the comments. So Jordan, set the stage for us on young pig nutrition and management. What are some uphill battles we continue to face? What are some opportunities for improvement?
Absolutely. We're here at the Pig Livability Conference, and a lot of discussion, a lot of areas of focus, research, and generating ideas to move forward and how do we keep pigs and keep them as healthy as possible and manage that issue. Certainly room for improvement on the south side, but specifically here in our conversation focusing on the young pig, the weaned pig, and how do we set that pig up for success and allow them to be successful throughout the nursery, but then out the grow finish and beyond. So some key areas that we'll talk about are some management practices, some nutrition that hopefully allow that pig to transition successfully into the nursery or into the wean to finish barn and ultimately be set up for success during the growing period.
So let's talk about some of that feeding management. In your latest research, you looked at floor feeding, creep feed, specifically bigger pellets for maybe a better transition. What were some key findings there?
Yeah, so that study looked at ways still when piglets were still nursing from their mothers in the farrowing house, what strategies can we use to creep feed those pigs using a few different techniques. One of them used lactation feed, so right out of the sow's feeder, put onto the mat in the lactation crate, or looking at a few different pellet sizes and that feed being put directly onto the mat. One of the key findings of that project was actually that when we took those strategies, those pigs that were provided those strategies, took them into the nursery, and we looked at growth performance and removals and mortality, the pigs that were provided the large size pellet still in the farrowing house, those pigs had lower removals and mortality in the nursery compared to pigs that were provided the lactation diet on the mat. So some information that was consistent and supported some previous research that says that large pellets actually can have a benefit in pigs compared to some other feed forms such as smaller pellets or feeding a mash lactation diet, specifically in those pigs during that creep feeding process.
That's interesting. I guess I would think, maybe smaller better for digestibility, but larger was the way to go.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was some work with creep feeding, also some work done once pigs were put into the nursery. And somewhat intuitively, we would think that small pellets would allow the pig to chew on that better and it would be easier for the pig to consume and utilize. But actually what we found is very large pellets, almost like a range cube that some may be familiar to feed to cattle, that very large size, the pigs actually prefer that and do better with that large pellet compared to smaller pellets, and they almost handle it like a chew toy, something large. There's a social component to it of interacting with that large pellet, feeling what that feels like and tastes in their mouth, and allowing them to transition into consuming feed much more effectively and reducing the amount of body weight that they lose after weaning. So several trials have been done that really indicate that some of these large pellets actually have a benefit compared to some other feed forms.
How about mat feeding strategies? What's research finding there?
Yeah, so mat feeding, the practice of taking pigs in the nursery or a wean to finish barn, taking feed out of the feeder and placing it on the mat for a period of several days, up to 7 or 10 days post-weaning. Mat feeding, through a series of trials, has been shown to successfully reduce the removal and mortality rate. It's a small change, but it's a meaningful and an incremental change that collectively, with several of these different practices combined together, can result in meaningful reductions in morbidity and mortality, but mat feeding through several trials together, we've shown to be effective to reduce morbidity and mortality.
Let's talk about gruel feeding. What are you seeing there in terms of removals, mortality?
Absolutely. So one project we looked at was the frequency of gruel feeding. So if pigs are taken from their pen and they're moved to an intensive care pen or a hospital pen, many times those pigs are provided gruel feed. Likewise, when small pigs are placed in the nursery, sometimes that smaller population of pigs is isolated, put by themselves to allow them to be provided extra care. So collectively within a project, we looked at the frequency of gruel feeding. What happens if we provide a gruel feed twice a day or 4 times per day? And that experiment, we didn't notice any differences or didn't measure any differences in morbidity or mortality rates. So as long as a producer is providing gruel feed in that very critical window, I think that's successful, but we didn't find any evidence of a difference between twice a day and 4 times a day, which hopefully will help producers prioritize what is the most effective use of their time to ultimately do what's best for the pig. And in that case, we didn't see any benefit of those 2 extra times grueling 4 times a day compared to twice daily.
You also discussed the influence of sire line on early nutrition nursery transition. Detail us for how that comes into play.
Absolutely. So that was a really interesting project that one of our PhD students, Maddie Wensley, led as part of her PhD training program, where we took 2 different divergently selected Duroc sire lines. So we took the semen, bred sows at our K-State Swine Teaching and Research Farm, and then once those pigs were born, we followed them through a series of projects all the way to market. And one of those sire lines was selected for early maturing growth, and one of them was selected for later maturing growth, meaning their growth rate and feed efficiency was very favorable later in the growing period, whereas the early maturing pig was expected to have greater levels of performance earlier in the nursery phase. So we took those 2 different Duroc sire lines, and what we found very clearly is that those different sire lines respond differently to the stress associated with weaning. And some of the most impactful measurements that we found was their feed intake was very, very different the first 2 weeks after weaning. That sire line selected for early maturing growth had higher feed intake shortly after weaning compared to the later maturing sire line, and that resulted in a reduction in the percentage of pigs that lose weight after weaning. Vice versa on the flip side, or when we followed those pigs, we saw exactly what we would expect, some very favorable gain and feed efficiency benefits with a later maturing sire line later in growth, but we're kind of balancing what are we trying to accomplish. Transition around weaning for that early stage growth versus better performance later in growth. So that was some really eye-opening information that hopefully allows collectively as an industry with our genetic suppliers and our collaborators to understand what are some of the different pieces, what are some of the different levers that play that we can select for to ultimately allow that pig to transition post-weaning successfully, but also be set up to have favorable long-term growth performance characteristics for swine producers as well. So a very nice study over a long time period from breeding all the way to following those offspring to market, but some very insightful and very informative findings as part of that.
Some great commercial applications there. After conducting these trials, these demonstrations, what would you say are some key considerations for producers to keep in mind? Is there, you talked about learning, maybe not, need 4 gruel feedings. Is there extra time needed in certain things as far as putting out the mat and even areas of other parts of the feeding areas? Is there labor conditions to think of and things like that?
Yeah, I think that focusing on wean to finish survivability with a particular focus on management practices and feeding practices, it's a combination of a lot of small pieces. Individually, any one of those, mat feeding, gruel feeding, creep feeding, by themselves aren't a silver bullet. But when done in combination and done well and implemented in a very consistent way, each of them can have a meaningful benefit for the swine producer. So I'd say that in that regard, there's many different things to focus on, but making sure we do them consistently and do them well is very important. And another consideration within the wean to finish mortality area is that some great work that's been done as part of the project at Iowa State has identified that roughly 2/3 of the amount of variation we see in wean to finish survivability is actually based on factors at the sow farm level. So characteristics or factors present when that pig is weaned explains a lot of the variation we see in wean to finish mortality. So focusing on areas such as sow farm health, sow farm productivity, and making sure that we get a good quality weaned pig at the time of weaning really allows us to set up for success during that wean to finish period. So it's kind of counterintuitive that much of the impact we see on wean to finish mortality starts at the sow farm, and even starts before that, when gilts are going through their development phase, acclimation, getting ready for breeding to enter the sow herd. All of those factors have a huge impact on wean to finish survivability.
As we talk about wean to finish survivability, what should the industry be focusing on in terms of nursery feeding practices and management?
I think it's continuing to work on the basics. And a lot of that, and what we see with a lot of the research, is caretaker involvement. So whether it be gruel feeding, mat feeding, a lot of those practices help integrate the animal caretaker into having eyes on the pigs, identifying fallback pigs quickly, removing them and getting them the additional care they need. If there needs to be a therapeutic intervention, identifying that and implementing that in a very time-effective manner. So again, it's a lot of small things, but I think having caretakers engaged in the process, looking at the pigs, getting the pigs up several times per day, all are very, very important to ultimately have the greatest level of success for that swine producer as possible.
Jordan Gebhardt, Kansas State University, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insight with us.
Thank you very much.
For you and our audience, we thank you for tuning in. For more coverage and conversations from the International Conference on Pig Livability, be sure to check out the National Hog Farmer and Feedstuffs websites, as well as our social media channels. For Feedstuffs and National Hog Farmer, I'm Ann Hess.